Hi, this is Kim, and this is video 2 for the immune system. And we're still talking about our innate, non-specific immunity. And part of that is your lymphatic system. Now, the lymphatic system is a term that's used interchangeably with immune system. It's such an important part of your immune system. I'm going to start by just pointing out some of the key components of your lymphatic system. First, you should notice this diagram. This is a blood vessel. And the green is what's called a lymphatic vessel. These lymphatic vessels mirror your blood vessels, and they pull out lymph, the fluid from your blood, and they filter. This is a lymph node. Your lymph nodes are all through your head, your face, your neck, your shoulders, your armpits, your abdomen, your groin. They're through your whole body. You can see some in your arms here. And they're these giant filtering structures. And they have these big masses of white blood cells that are there to kill invaders. So anything foreign that they filter out, the white blood cells are there to destroy those pathogens. So if you get inflammation in your lymph node, that means that something foreign was filtered out, and now there's an inflammatory response. Send a lot of fluid, more white blood cells to the area to try to wipe out that invader. Other components of your lymphatic system that I'm sure you've heard of most of these, your adenoids and your tonsils. Filtering structures very commonly get inflamed. If you get them removed, not the end of the world, because there's a ton of redundancy in this system, which just tells you how important this system is. This is your thymus on top of your sternum. That's where your T cells are going to mature. We'll talk about that in a minute. Your spleen, major filtering structure. And as I'm sure you've probably heard, if your spleen ruptures, massive amounts of bacteria spill out and could actually kill you because that's too much toxicity all at once into your abdominal cavity. On your small intestine, you have what are called Peyer's patches. Here's your appendix. Okay, again, these are all filtering structures that are a part of your lymphatic system. Filter out the pathogen and destroy it. I want to quickly show you that all blood cells in your body come from stem cells in your bone marrow. What are stem cells? Stem cells are undifferentiated cells, meaning they haven't been programmed yet to be a specific cell type. Now, in this case, we're talking about blood stem cells. Okay, so these cells can't go become a brain cell or a liver cell. They are destined to be a blood cell. They're just not specific yet in what type of blood cell. The body can make whatever kind you need if you have a healthy functioning system. So in theory, you should be able to produce more of whatever specific type of blood cell you need to do that job. So here you can see red blood cells, also called your erythrocytes. Remember, your white blood cells were called your leukocytes. And leuko means white, and cyte means cell. So these are your white cells. Erythro means red. So these are your red blood cells. Remember, they're involved in oxygen carrying in the body. They carry oxygen and a little bit of CO2. Most of your CO2 is transported in the bloodstream, dissolved in the blood, but a little bit is carried on the erythrocytes. Platelets are involved in blood clotting. And then you can see all the different types of white blood cells we've talked about: eosinophil, neutrophil, basophil. Now we get to the lymphocytes. You can see B cells and T cells. So the B cells actually mature in the bone marrow. The T cells, though, are going to mature in the thymus. And I showed you that thymus a minute ago in the lymphatic system diagram right on top of your sternum. Natural killer cells I did not talk about in the previous video. These actually attack your own infected cells rather than attacking the pathogen itself. And they also attack and destroy cancer cells. So killing cancer cells is an important role of your immune system as well. You want your immune system patrolling, picking out those abnormal cells and destroying them before they divide out of control to the point where you develop tumors and have full-blown cancer. This is another picture of your white blood cells, and there is a separate video that will teach you how to visually recognize these 5 types of white blood cell. So I'm not going to talk about that in a lot of detail. You can see, though, that the ones called the granulocytes, the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, have little granules that are visible, and you'll see that even better in the video. You can also see that the nuclei are different on all of those types of white blood cell. Okay, now I'm going to switch back to the notes for a few minutes. And we're going to start talking about our acquired immunity. It's also called our adaptive immunity and our specific immunity, because it is very specific to a specific antigen. And it takes time to develop. It develops after exposure to a specific antigen. So let's say that you unfortunately become infected with the COVID-19, which is a SARS-CoV-2 virus. And you have been sick for a number of days. You started feeling achy and tired. You started running fever. You have this strong inflammatory response. And at some point, your immune system realizes that all of this general stuff is not enough to kill this pathogen. And some cytokines are released by your white blood cells, and it's going to signal your immune system that a specific response is needed. Now, on first exposure, we're not nearly as protected as we are on second exposure. So second exposure to a specific antigen, you're going to have this really exaggerated response. I mean, you're going to have a huge response on second exposure, but first exposure, it's going to take some time. And what is the goal is developing antibodies. Antibodies are part of our specific immune response. And those antibodies are produced by our B cells. Your B cells are one of your types of lymphocytes. Antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins, and they have areas where a specific antigen can bind. So here's the antigen, and here's the antibody. And these antibodies can be in the blood, okay, or they can be on an actual B cell. What triggers the production, though, are the main controlling cells of your specific immune response, and that is your T cells, and specifically, it's your helper T cells. Your helper T cells are a type of lymphocyte that orchestrates your specific immune response. And I'm not going to go into the details of that today, but your helper T cells are the primary cells that help you confer what's called immune memory. Your adaptive immunity, your acquired immunity, includes immune memory, and that is your antibodies and some other memory cells that happen as a result of your T cells orchestrating this specific immune response. So your lymphocytes include your B cells and your T cells. And under T cells, you have two categories. You have your helper T cells and what are sometimes called your cytotoxic. I didn't spell that right, sorry. I left off a syllable. Your cytotoxic T cells. Your cytotoxic T cells are involved in destroying foreign cells and infected cells. Whereas your helper T cells, these are the guys who orchestrate a lot of different things, including signaling the B cells to produce antibodies. Some of those antibodies stick around, and we're not sure how long that happens with COVID-19, but we do know that in most cases, if you get a specific bacterial or viral infection, your B cells are eventually going to produce antibodies, and those become part of your immune memory. And if you are ever infected with that pathogen again, your immune system is armed and ready to wipe out that pathogen very, very quickly. Those antibodies bind the antigen, and it now can't get into your cells and become infectious. Your helper T cells orchestrate a big part of this specific immune response. These are also the very cells that HIV infects. There's going to be an entire video on HIV, but HIV completely cripples your immune system because the very cells that would normally fight that virus are the cells that are infected. You will learn, if you go on to take a higher level biology class, you will learn exactly what those helper T cells do to orchestrate that specific immune response. Okay, so your B cells make the antibodies. T cells, you have your helper T cells that are going to signal the other cells to do what they need to do. And then you're going to have those cytotoxic T cells that wipe out infected cells and foreign cells, including cancer cells in some cases. It's very important to know two other terms as well, because you will see these terms if you go on to take higher level biology classes. Your B cells are what's called your humoral immunity. B cells and antibodies are part of your humoral immunity, whereas your T cells are part of what's called your cell mediated immunity. Associated with all of this, we have some cells that are called the antigen presenting cells. And those antigen presenting cells we talked about a little bit under your general non-specific immunity. Those include the macrophages and also some cells called the dendritic cells. They're called dendritic cells because they have this shape that's kind of similar to the dendrites on a nerve cell. And those dendritic cells and the macrophages present antigens to the immune system, and the immune system is going to now respond. One of the possible responses is that the T cells signal the B cells to produce antibodies. There are a variety of responses that can happen. One of the responses could be that the cytotoxic T cells come and destroy an infected cell. So antigen presenting cells are an important part of the story as well. Again, you will learn a lot more about them if you go on to take a higher level biology class. I just want to quickly show you though, in closing, I want to show you a diagram of the difference between humoral immunity and cell-mediated immunity. And I just have a quick table to show you that. Okay, humoral immunity versus cell-mediated immunity. Okay, so humoral immunity involves the B lymphocytes, the B cells. Remember, the B cells are produced in the bone marrow and they mature in the bone marrow. It involves the production of antibodies, and the pathogen is killed by antibodies. You don't need to know those other details. Okay, cell-mediated immunity involves the T cells, which are produced in the bone marrow, but they mature in the thymus, and it does not involve the production of antibodies. Okay, pathogens are killed by specialized killer T cells, those cytotoxic T cells. You don't need to know the other parts. I want to show you again this picture of these Y-shaped proteins called antibodies, and you can see the antigen binding site on that antibody. Sorry about that. Right there is where that's going to bind. And the point of this is that antibodies are very antigen specific. That's why you need a different flu shot every year, because as that virus mutates, the antibodies that you produced last year are no longer going to bind that slightly different virus. You need different antibodies for every specific pathogen. And that's because that binding site is very shape specific. Remember, shape is key in biology. And the shape of that binding site on the antibody is very, very specific. Vaccinations stimulate antibody production. So you can make antibodies as a result of natural exposure or through getting a vaccination. So a vaccination is a non-infectious, non-toxic version of that pathogen, and you're tricking your immune system into thinking it's the real thing, and you produce antibodies. Remember, I said second exposure, the response is big. So first exposure is with the fake version. So first exposure would be your vaccination, non-harmful version of the pathogen. So if you ever get exposed to the real thing, the harmful version of the pathogen, your second exposure, you already have the antibodies ready to go, and you're going to have a big immune response. And hopefully wipe out that pathogen before you ever get sick. The soldiers are already there. This shows you, sorry, antibodies attached to a B cell, and then antibodies free in the blood. And you can see it's about to bind that bacterial cell. This shows you the antigen presenting cells. It shows you macrophages and dendritic cells. B cells can also be antigen presenting cells. And then one last thing I just wanted to remind you of. Your immune system recognizes self in part because of markers on your cell surfaces. And the MHC is one of those markers that allows your immune system to recognize self. The MHC is also where a piece of the antigen occurs to signal the immune system that that cell has been infected with something foreign. So the MHC plays an important role in our immune response. It's really interesting that scientists have now figured out that your individual smell is due to your MHC. So everyone has a slightly different MHC. Everyone has a slightly different smell. That's how we recognize each other and are attracted to each other. And, you know, that's how mamas recognize their babies. Okay, they've done studies where after childbirth, they'll bring in several babies and the mom can't visually recognize the baby as hers or not. She can't always pick out which baby is hers. You've gone through this trauma of childbirth. All these babies come in, they kind of look similar. You can't really pick it out, but they can send in some t-shirts that were worn by different babies, and moms can pick out their newborn baby's t-shirt from the smell. We are animals. We have those same instincts. We can recognize the smell of our mates, our relatives, our babies, and the MHC plays a role in that. So they think the MHC actually plays a role in mate selection, who you're attracted to and who you're not. They think it is what prevents inbreeding in a lot of animals because they shouldn't be attracted to the odor of someone with whom they're closely related as far as sexually attracted. So I think that's pretty interesting. When this whole thing goes awry is when you end up with autoimmune disorders. And autoimmune disorders are when the immune system attacks self. Destroying your own cells and tissues. And unfortunately, in humans, we have over 100 different autoimmune diseases. You can see examples here. In the brain, multiple sclerosis, leukemia, lupus, celiac disease, Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, peripheral neuropathy, diabetic neuropathy, fibromyalgia, psoriasis, vitiligo, eczema, different forms of muscular dystrophy, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, different thyroid conditions such as Graves' disease. So we're still trying to figure out what goes wrong in the chemical signaling. What's happening to cause your white blood cells to suddenly start destroying healthy tissue, especially when it's a specific cell type that they are attacking. So that's it for the immune system. Thanks.